When I arrived home from my short stay at the sanatorium, everything seemed the same. The same quiet house, the same stacks of papers from my classes, and, of course, my wife, Julia, waiting at the door with a smile. It was a sight I had missed. As a teacher, life is often routine. Students, lessons, assignments, and the endless stream of grading. The sanatorium had been a welcome break, a chance to refresh, although I never expected that what awaited me would turn my life completely upside down. In the days following my return, I resumed my regular schedule at the college. I had students eager to catch up and assignments to review, and for a while everything felt normal. But as the week progressed, something strange started to happen. I noticed side glances from colleagues, averted eyes from students who typically enjoyed chatting with me, and an awkwardness I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until a few days later, in the staff lounge, that I overheard two junior faculty members, whispering quietly yet just loudly enough for me to catch fragments. I caught the words, "Can you believe she would do that to him? Poor guy." And something about a student, and my heart sank. I felt my stomach twist as the pieces started forming. Even if I didn't want to believe them, I was caught between disbelief and fear, hoping it was all some misunderstanding. But by the end of the day, I couldn't escape the whispers, the pitying looks, and the mounting dread that maybe, just maybe, something had happened while I was away. Unable to shake the anxiety gnawing at me, I decided to confront Julia. That evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, I took a deep breath and voiced the fears I'd been carrying since I returned. "Julia," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I've heard things and I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything I should know?" She paused, her fork midair, and for a second a flicker of something, guilt, panic, crossed her face. She recovered quickly, setting her fork down and meeting my gaze with a look of practiced calm. "What are you talking about, darling?" she asked, her voice steady, almost too steady. The unease I had been trying to ignore surged to the surface, and in a rush, I poured out what I had heard, the whispers, the glances, everything. To my surprise, Julia laughed. A brittle, forced laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "Those are just rumors, silly," she replied, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. "You know how people love to gossip." Her words should have been reassuring, but instead, they left me feeling hollow. I knew Julia, and this laugh, this dismissive tone, it wasn't her. Something was wrong, and every instinct told me that she was hiding something. The next morning, I arrived at the college determined to put the rumors to rest. I wanted to believe Julia, to trust that she would never betray me, especially with a student. But as I entered my classroom, I noticed a few students stifling laughter, casting knowing glances at me. This wasn't just gossip. Something concrete was fueling these whispers. By lunch, I could no longer resist. I went to see Henry, a fellow teacher and longtime friend, who I knew had his ear to the ground. If anyone would know what was happening, it would be him. "Henry?" I started, barely able to keep the desperation from my voice. "I need to know what's going on. I've heard things I can't ignore. Is there something about Julia?" Henry hesitated, glancing around before pulling me into an empty classroom. "Listen, I don't know how to say this, but there's been talk. People say that Julia, well, that she might have been involved with one of your students. A young guy around 20. It started when you were away. I didn't want to tell you, but the rumors, they're everywhere." The words felt like a punch to the gut. I staggered, gripping the edge of the desk for support as the room spun. It wasn't just a rumor. Henry had confirmed my worst fear. I felt a strange numbness take over, like a shield, protecting me from the pain that was sure to follow. "Thank you, Henry," I mumbled, barely able to meet his gaze. I needed to get out of there, to breathe, to think. But most of all, I needed to know the truth. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on work, to ignore the weight pressing down on me. But every time I saw a student, every time someone looked at me with pity, the wound tore open a little wider. It wasn't until I heard his name, whispered by two students outside my office, that I finally knew who it was. "Ryan." One of the newer students, a transfer, younger, cocky, the kind of kid who believed the world was his for the taking. I remembered him vaguely. A bright student but always distracted, always glancing at his phone, always with that smug, self-assured smile. The image of Ryan, laughing, leaning close to Julia, filled my mind, and I felt my fists clench involuntarily. I needed answers. I needed to hear it from him, even if it meant confronting him directly. That afternoon, I waited by the student lounge until he appeared, swaggering through the hall like he owned the place. I blocked his path, my heart pounding in my chest, and met his gaze head-on. "Ryan?" I said, my voice low, barely containing the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I need to talk to you. Now." He looked taken aback but recovered quickly, a smirk playing on his lips as he nodded and led me outside. As we stood in the courtyard, away from prying eyes, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "There are rumors," I began, choosing my words carefully, "about you and my wife. I need to know if they're true." To my surprise, Ryan didn't deny it. Instead, he shrugged, as if it was the most casual thing in the world. "Yeah," he said, his tone indifferent. "We had some fun." She didn't seem too worried about it, so why should I be? After that devastating conversation with Ryan, my mind was a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. I couldn't believe Julia would risk everything we'd built for a moment with this kid. When I returned home that night, Julia was already in bed, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her phone screen. The sight only fueled my frustration. I walked into the bedroom and stood silently, waiting for her to notice me. She glanced up, offering a small, nervous smile, as though she knew what was coming. Taking a deep breath, I cut right to the chase. "I spoke to Ryan today," I said, my voice tense. "He told me everything." Her expression flickered, fear evident in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "What did he tell you?" she replied, her voice wavering. I felt my patience thinning. "You know exactly what he told me?" I snapped, unable to keep the anger from seeping through. "You betrayed me, Julia, with a student no less." She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't deny it. I deserve the truth, and I deserve to hear it from you." Her silence stretched painfully, each second amplifying my anger and hurt. Finally, she looked down, her hands fidgeting nervously, and she whispered, "I'm sorry." The days that followed were a blur. I went to work, but I felt disconnected, like I was moving through a fog. The pitying looks from my colleagues, the whispered conversations. Everything reminded me of Julia's betrayal. I wanted to move past it, to bury the hurt and pretend it never happened, but every memory felt like a knife in my chest. Julia and I barely spoke, both of us moving like strangers through our shared space. She tried to apologize a few times, but I was too hurt, too angry to listen. At night, I lay awake, my mind racing with questions I knew I'd never get answers to. Why Ryan? What had I done wrong? Was our marriage always this fragile? By the end of the week, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I needed some sort of closure, something to help me make sense of it all. But instead of confronting Julia again, I found myself drawn to Ryan, this young, arrogant kid who had shattered my world without a second thought. I wanted answers, and I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done. The desire for revenge grew stronger each day. I knew confronting Ryan again would accomplish nothing. He had already proven he didn't care. But as the days went on, an idea began to form in my mind, absurd and a little dangerous, but the thought of it gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I would make Ryan feel the way I felt, vulnerable, humiliated, powerless. I knew he had a reputation at the college, a notorious flirt with a history of shallow relationships. He prided himself on his charm, and I realized that his ego was the perfect target. I decided to play a little mind game of my own, a psychological revenge that would leave him questioning himself and his own worth. Over the next few days, I subtly dropped hints about him to other students, small insinuations that would ripple through the campus. I planted seeds of doubt and mistrust, letting his classmates believe he was the source of campus drama and turmoil. It was petty, yes, but seeing him uncomfortable gave me a strange, bittersweet sense of control. Amidst my plot against Ryan, Julia approached me one night, her face pale, eyes red from crying. She looked defeated, as though carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. I kept my guard up, unsure of what to expect. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can we talk?" I considered ignoring her, but curiosity got the best of me. I nodded, sitting across from her as she began to speak, her words halting and filled with regret. She explained everything: the loneliness she felt while I was away, the temptation, the mistake that spiraled out of control. She swore it meant nothing, that it was a lapse in judgment, and that she regretted it more than she could ever say. But despite her tears, her apologies, I felt nothing. Her words were hollow, an echo of the trust that was now irreparably broken. In the days that followed, Julia's confession did little to soothe my pain. Instead, it seemed to open old wounds, leaving me feeling more bitter and lost than before. I started avoiding her entirely, choosing to stay late at the college or spending hours wandering the city alone, lost in thought. One night, I received a message from a former student, someone I'd mentored years ago who now worked in journalism. She had heard whispers about my situation and offered an idea, one that was as absurd as it was tempting. "Why don't you write about it?" she suggested. "Tell your story, make it public. Let people see what you went through." At first, the thought seemed ridiculous, but as I sat with the idea, it started to make a strange kind of sense. I could turn my pain into something tangible, a narrative that would help me process my emotions and, maybe, help others going through similar experiences. Fueled by a mix of anger and desperation, I began writing. I poured my heart into every word, recounting the betrayal, the hurt, the confusion. I held nothing back, detailing every painful moment and laying bare my broken trust. The words came easily, a cathartic release that felt like therapy. I posted the story anonymously, giving it a title that would catch the attention of readers everywhere. To my surprise, the story went viral. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences, offering sympathy and support. It was surreal watching my private pain become a public spectacle, but in some strange way, it helped. I felt less alone, less trapped by the hurt that had consumed me for so long. Here's a detailed look at parts 11 to 14, capturing the tension and complexity as the story builds toward its strange and absurd finale. After sharing his story publicly, the teacher expected some support, but he didn't anticipate the intensity of the response. Initially, people sympathized, sharing their own stories of betrayal and sending messages of encouragement. But as the story gained traction, the backlash began. Some accused him of oversharing or even trying to ruin Julia's life. Others argued that he was airing private matters for attention and validation, fueling a fire that didn't need to burn so brightly. The teacher found himself reading through the mixed comments, torn between frustration and confusion. People who knew nothing of his marriage were calling him selfish, while others blamed him for leaving Julia lonely enough to stray. His post had unintentionally painted Julia as both a villain and a victim in the public's eyes, and he struggled with the idea that perhaps he'd gone too far. Among the reactions, however, one message stood out: a furious email from Ryan himself. The young man was livid, accusing the teacher of ruining his reputation. Ryan argued that he'd been unfairly targeted and that he was now a pariah on campus. In his message, Ryan demanded that the teacher delete the post immediately, stating that he had the right to privacy as well. The teacher felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that, for once, Ryan was experiencing some of the shame he'd caused. Shortly after Ryan's furious message, the teacher encountered him by the campus parking lot one afternoon. Ryan was visibly upset, his confident exterior cracked, and he appeared far more vulnerable than the arrogant young man he remembered. Approaching him with an unexpected desperation, Ryan began pleading for a truce. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "You've made my life hell. Everywhere I go, people are talking about me. Just take the story down. You've already hurt me enough." The teacher felt a mix of anger and pity. Seeing the man who disrupted his life so completely now asking for mercy was oddly satisfying, but also exhausting. For a moment, the teacher considered agreeing, but then he countered with a strange proposal of his own. "I'll take it down," he said. "On one condition. I want you to apologize publicly, not just to me, but to anyone else your actions may have hurt." Ryan looked at him in shock, as though this condition was beyond his capacity to fulfill. But faced with few options, he reluctantly agreed. As if the situation weren't complicated enough, Julia delivered another emotional blow later that evening. She returned home visibly tense, unable to meet his eyes as she sat him down to talk. She appeared almost haunted, like someone carrying a burden she could no longer bear. With her voice trembling, Julia confessed that her relationship with Ryan wasn't an isolated incident. She admitted that there had been others, students, colleagues, even a mutual friend, during times she had felt neglected or unseen in their marriage. Each revelation struck the teacher like a hammer, leaving him numb with disbelief. Julia explained that these encounters had been her misguided attempts at finding connection while he was consumed by his career. Her voice cracked with regret, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely remorseful, even scared, but he could hardly bring himself to react. Her words felt distant, as though he were watching a movie about someone else's life. He stared at her, feeling the last remnants of trust and love crumble away. This wasn't the woman he thought he'd married, and he realized he no longer knew her at all. After Julia's confession, the teacher's life felt surreal. Nothing seemed to hold meaning anymore. Everything he thought he knew was gone, replaced by betrayal and shame. He threw himself into work, avoided his colleagues, and distanced himself from anything that reminded him of his shattered marriage. Then, one afternoon, he received an unexpected email from Ryan's mother. She claimed she'd heard about the scandal and wanted to meet to discuss her son's suffering. Intrigued by the strange request, the teacher agreed, meeting her at a nearby cafe to see what she had to say. Ryan's mother turned out to be as intense as her son, but with a calculated, defensive manner. She began by expressing sympathy, explaining that she knew how difficult marriage could be. However, she quickly shifted the conversation, attempting to reframe Ryan's involvement with Julia as a misunderstanding. She insisted it had been an academic mentorship gone wrong, a claim so absurd it was almost laughable. The teacher listened, barely concealing his incredulity as she painted her son as a troubled youth who'd merely been seeking guidance. She concluded with a bizarre proposal. If he would stop spreading the story, she promised Ryan would publicly apologize and stay away from Julia and him. The teacher realized the conversation was as absurd as his life had become, and he left, feeling more disconnected than ever. After this meeting, he saw clearly that his life had veered into the absurd, that he was caught in a surreal nightmare of betrayal and cover-ups. He knew in that moment that he had to reclaim his life, and that somehow letting go of this tangled mess was his only way out. And though he didn't know exactly how the story would end, he felt ready to close the strange and painful chapter, regardless of what anyone else thought. After my meeting with Ryan's mother, I returned home, convinced that the absurdity of my life had reached its peak. Little did I know the grand finale was yet to come. A few days later, Julia called me unexpectedly. She claimed to have a life-changing proposal for me and insisted that we meet in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed, driven by a strange mix of curiosity and masochistic amusement. We met at the very cafe where I had met Ryan's mother. Julia arrived dressed impeccably, as if nothing had happened, her face betraying no sign of guilt or remorse. She sat down, gave me a serene smile, and then delivered her proposal. "Listen," she began, her voice calm and composed. "I've had time to think about everything, and I think we should turn this whole situation into something positive." I stared at her, baffled, as she continued. "I think we should sell the story rights. Think about it. With everything that's happened, this has all the makings of a bestseller or a viral documentary. I've already been in touch with a couple of producers, and they're interested in the potential of Teacher, Student, and Wife, the scandal as a TV series. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, who had shattered my life, was now proposing we capitalize on the chaos she'd caused. But, absurdly, the proposal didn't end there. "And here's the best part," she continued, eyes gleaming. "The producers suggested we include you as a consultant on the series. They think it would add authenticity if the betrayed husband was involved in telling his side of the story." At that point, I couldn't hold back a laugh. A genuine, deep laugh that startled both of us. This proposal was so outlandish, so insane, that it felt like the perfect, absurd ending to this entire saga. I looked Julia in the eye, shook my head, and stood up, finally feeling free of all the anger, betrayal, and chaos that had haunted me. "No, Julia," I replied, still chuckling. "I think this is where my story ends." I walked out of the cafe, leaving her there with her grand ideas, and finally felt a weight lift from my shoulders. And that, dear readers, was the last chapter of the wild, ridiculous journey that was my marriage.